it means a lot. And I want folks to appreciate, like, you are really, really connected to the world in terms of things like negotiating for hostage releases and helping us get to ceasefires. So you taking time, it means a lot. And for everybody, I appreciate you doing it with us.
You're very welcome. And often the thing, people might think when you can't talk about something that it's because it's clandestine or shadowy, or it's something like that. It's that more often than not, it's just that a solution to a problem needs a chance to mature. And in this particular setting, where you have ultimately bad faith actors on each side, that you have to take extra care to be able to ensure kind of the result. And sort of the detail and the inner workings of things, or how things get done, or how communication lines operate, have to be protected for a variety of reasons. But the impact of the work is certainly visible as quietly as it gets done. And it kind of, it's fascinating to see, kind of language that we had very specifically, or premise that you have very specifically, and it's suddenly coming out of, a Ministry of Foreign Affairs, or it's coming out of the mouth of the Secretary of State. It's like, that's our language. That's always fascinating.
There's a couple things to say there, and so one of them is they like to ask former President Trump, questions about his, like, how are you going to get the Iranians to agree to this? He's like, I'm not going to tell you that, because I'm not telling the Iranians that yet, and so, like, we're so desperate to know, like, the how and the nuts and the bolts, and then we want to criticize it for being a bad idea. It's not about Donald Trump, but it's about our passion to know these things. And then, if you just watch how people behave on social media, and if you say something that's contrary to them, it's all in. Absolutely, you're wrong. You're stupid. You're this. You're that, and everything else. Like, well, so you don't even have the room to negotiate. Like, hey, maybe in between us is a better form of the truth, but you don't want to give a thing up. You don't even want to say, hey, sorry for being a dick, right? And so, at your level, when you're looking at these agreements and negotiations, you do have to allow the person to come to you a little bit. And if you don't have that tolerance, that willingness to allow them to get to where they need to be so they can get to a disagreement. By the way, the other side too, maybe three sides, then you can't get to that agreement, because everybody's going to dig in, even if it's to everybody's detriment.
Yeah, you lose the ability for the maturation on the sensitive things, or the part, or the pain points more than sensitive. And then you get too many people with opinions that don't have the necessary foundational knowledge, that haven't been involved in something to know the details, or to what may come next. Or it's impossible. And I do understand people's hunger and thirst for knowledge, but as you said, they're ready to cast judgment final without paying attention to the layers around something. So, this has just been the current thing, obviously, that we face is the concern that we'll just see phase one. And this is kind of where we see, like when we talk about language, like one of the things that we talked about a lot over the past 8 months in papers and submissions that go really around the world, whether it be to Europe or to the Middle East or to North America, safeguards. Because there is a clear intention, in parts of the Netanyahu government, who like Smotrich and Ben-Gvir, to continue the war, who have a vision that involves, never having a two-state, that involves annexing parts of, if not all of, Gaza. And they talk about things like encourage displacement. It's not encouraged. I mean, just rendering an area uninhabitable isn't encouraging people to leave. It's forcing them. And so with all these things sort of happen, it's a lot of people mistake the idea that there isn't a lot of work done on the day after. It just hasn't been done so much in DC. It hasn't been done there. It's really come out of the parties on the ground. And that's very, very interesting, and maybe a very good thing to have happen, because it can be more of a contextual plan than something that's dreamt up in DC.
Right. There's competing factors too, right? So it's not just egos, it's not just the war and everything that goes into that. There's also, and you alluded to this, there's, and we'll just use the Israeli side, there's their own political ambition, and whatever it
Yep.
is, party ambition and land ambition that goes
Mhm.
into this. So it's not just a straightforward thing. Talk a little bit about how you navigate I'm going to call it the secondary and the tertiary level
Mhm.
of what has to be satisfied or quelled to be able to get something like this,
I mean,
which looks right now as like a ceasefire today. But if it broke while we're talking, we wouldn't be surprised if it broke.
no, I would be surprised if it broke, and we didn't get the first. I mean,
Okay.
the first
Okay.
few hostages back. It could break at a
Yeah.
point in phase one because they come back over a period,
Right.
which logically for Hamas makes sense because if you gave this first tranche of hostages back on day one, then most likely um, there would be some kind of precipitory event to reinitiate the conflict. So you're dealing with um, sort of zero trust
Mm,
and zero faith negotiations, and zero
right.
faith because ultimately Hamas's primary and original goal was the destruction of Israel,
Right.
and the primary goal of people like Smotrich and Ben-Gvir has been the total destruction of Gaza and West Bank as well,
Yep.
the total destruction of Palestine for their religious beliefs. And so neither of those two groups are set well to negotiate. And then there's the wider issues of Netanyahu's own political issues with the various charges against him from within Israel.
Yeah.
And the continuation of the war has served his needs. So it's been, and that's been a really, really weird experience because I would watch. I kind of became more active in the background, at a kind of very important layer of the ceasefire about February, March. And
Okay.
even before the three-phase plan came about in May, there was talk about getting ceasefire moving and everything else like that. And as it would come back, you would watch on like a Friday night, Netanyahu would sink it, or on a Sunday
Mm.
while the White House is out, or on a federal holiday. And it was
Hmm.
every
Hmm.
single time. We would say it's just being torpedoed. And people like, no, 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 that would never happen. And now it's come out very openly because Smotrich himself came out and said, we've managed to successfully sabotage all the ceasefires before. And that just happened a couple of days ago. So I was like, yeah, we've got admission that we have bad faith actors
Yeah.
across the board. But for Hamas is in a very different position. Um, and, they're not behaving pragmatically, with their spokesman making idiotic comments today about, the enemy will be defeated and da 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 da. It's
Right.
Gaza has suffered tremendously, and
Mm.
the ceasefire isn't a victory when you have such massive casualty of civilians. And
Right.
these are innocent people. They're not your martyrs. They're just people that happen to live in Gaza that,
Mm.
they're not a
Yeah.
resource of suffering to be exploited, which is how they were treated in some regards. But
Right.
Hamas really, and I've said this in the briefings, that Hamas has taken this to a situation where there isn't a ceasefire and they continue violence, they will ultimately only render the destruction of Palestine whole. And if they
Yeah.
continue this destruction, whatever good faith they have created, they will eradicate if a
Mm.
plausible ceasefire was presented. So I don't think Hamas is really motivated to break the ceasefire because if they were, then Israel would come back and pressure and say, look, you can't make peace with these people.
Right.
Uh, they have
Right.
to be destroyed totally. Um, is that really viable? Because Hamas started at about 20,000 fighters, and through the war, Israel has probably killed 15, 16,000 of them, but they've apparently reconstituted to 20,000 fighters. Now that's
Right.
20,000 untrained fighters.
Yeah.
Um, but if we handle this incorrectly, then they may get opportunity to train. So we have to, then come and look at, well, how do we build on the willingness of Hamas to transition out of power, which we've known since September. We've known that they're willing to. So it's been really, really complicated, but now is not the time to breathe and relax, because the families, some of them will have their loved ones back, but many will not until phase 2, and that is just very generally referred to as phase 2 sustainable calm. But to have that sustainable calm, there is so much hard work that needs to happen now. And there really hasn't been enough reliable, pragmatic engagement from the international community around what is this going to look like. It's been worked out locally, but that needs to happen fast, because without that mount, you can't have conversations about rebuilding Gaza, because no one can rebuild Gaza while Hamas is in power. No one's going to invest. And the private sector isn't going to come and re-enable the economy, at least internationally speaking, because you'll never get insurance. How are you going to rebuild? And that's a real question. And so
let's slow down right here, because this is a key thing. We often say insurance, and we don't think anything more than that. It's just a company that does things. But these are gamblers. And they only make gambles that they know they're going to win. And so, some amount of damage we expect. But if it's greater than, say, 5%, we're out, because our return. And so they've done this forever, and they know how to do it. And so when the bettors are saying, hey, that's too long of a bet, we all have to look around and go, yeah, those guys know what they're doing. They don't lose on these things. And so it means for them, it's not possible.
And that's why, I often tell people, if you want to look at geopolitics, look at what insurance is doing. If you want to talk about climate change, is it real? Well, the insurance industry thinks so.
Right.
And so,
and
then these are the pragmatic things. So Hamas needs to look at the situation pragmatically. And although they make these aggressive outward noises, like the Iranians do it all the time, there are pragmatic elements within that. I think we'll see Iran drift towards some kind of normalization towards the West. It's not in their interests to be destroyed. I mean, they have lost so much of their force projection with the death of Nasrallah, who was ultimately the hero of the Shia militias. And that leads to the collapse of Syria, and that leads to pressures now on Iraq. So the other argument, at least really once Syria happened, is that, we've seen the pressure that this war has created on countries like Egypt, starts to create pressure on Sisi. Then what happens if we end up in a situation where that government perhaps gets toppled, and then we get another, we get an extremist government, like we had in 2013. Now we've got a very different space for Israel itself. And then we've obviously got the concerns that Egypt has about Israel's expansion into the Sinai as part of greater Israel, which Smotrich likes to go on television with, and to the point that even the ministries of Saudi Arabia and UAE sent formal notices that they published online stating that this map, because it takes Jordan, it takes parts of Iraq, it takes more of Syria, it takes parts of Saudi, it takes parts of Egypt, that this is very destabilizing, and it sends a message when Netanyahu has been unable to control these people, that at some point he will be playing or pandering to them, and thereby their vision of expansion. By leaving Gaza, we take the pressure off of all these countries. Less so Syria because of the expansion of the buffer zone, but certainly for Jordan, certainly for Iraq, certainly for Egypt. And so that becomes really an important argument, because then if we have this continued expansion that creates instability and then does lead to large scale combined aggression from, say, Iran and, say, all those very, very experienced fighters in Syria, it'll need American boots on the ground to defend Israel. Now we're in a
go ahead.
No, once that happens, we're in a different space. The American public may not want to have American soldiers defending Netanyahu's government, and one has separate Israel from Netanyahu's government, because over 73% or even 80% of Israelis want an end to the war and a ceasefire. So he's not being representative, democratically speaking, of the will of the people.
Right. Yeah, boy, there's a lot in there. I want to go way back in time and talk about something that within this conversation, we've had a lot of conversations, but one of the KPIs that I'm looking for when I'm collecting overseas back in my old days, and I'm working for a commander, is, I'm feeding information in, and I'm writing my analysis, giving my opinion on what I'm seeing and everything else. And when I start to hear my words leak into their conversations and planning, I know that I have reached another level of performance, and that takes new steps. Like, oh, I have to start doing this now, because what they're reading is influencing how they do things. When you're saying things like these international agreements have your language in it, which you and I have talked about this, that means that you have a higher level of play and different. For me, from my point of view, my experience, you have different levels of responsibility. You have to now add up to get to the next level to make sure that you continue to protect that pathway that you're on. Does this resonate with you at all?
100%. I mean, it's quite a strange thing. I mean, there are topics really that only we've been discussing, and things that only we really raised and repeatedly, is that the essential nature of the West Bank, the body that's recognized as, within the United Nations with status. Sorry. But it's also a party that could elect international partners as host nation into Gaza. As if Hamas leaves power and there is no transitional government, ultimately it becomes, legally speaking, land. So it has to come under the administration as the legal party. Otherwise, these reconstruction, rebuilding, capacity building, this is not possible, which is why it was so important to protect, and why that argument. And so, to the example, you'll see Blinken talks about that in his address to the Atlantic Council. And there was really no one else fighting, aside our little team, bringing this to the attention of what I generally refer to as the powers that be in the US and Europe, because to have that. And so it is, but I guess the part that what really try to do is work in the benefit of the interests of the communities that are affected by the violence or instability, because no one wants to live in a constant state of bombardment, really, except for people exploiting fear and violence for control, and then they invariably project violence control against their own people, benefit from this. So the point and the way I work is that work with the people in the host nation and the communities with 100% integrity, but also not letting anything harmful filter in. I mean, just base facts. These are the facts. It is going to be a neutral report, and then and it's not my job necessarily. I remind this whenever I brief anything into certain countries. I am not a citizen of your country. I'm not being paid to do this. This is not influence. This is it. This is the statements. This is the analysis of what's happening on the ground. You go verify it. But now you know where to start. And if you don't like it, don't do it. So this is not about being part of the great game. I think the great game has been a disaster. I think what we've done is we've taught countries like Turkey to play the great game. Netanyahu has become quite a skilled player of the great game. And so now these middling countries are able to cause massive destabilization. And now we have Erdogan and Netanyahu squaring off at each other. And we need to get out of this Cold War thinking of spheres of influence. You want to have influence, soft power, be a good partner, invest in things, create jobs, make a country happy to see your diplomats when they turn up and when your tourists come. Then you'll have that.
Can we make it complicated for a second? Can we take all this? Because one, we talked about like the expansion of the war and everything, and we haven't talked really in depth about. And this is just me painting this picture. Then you fill the colors in. But Syria is a mess. By the way, Lebanon got dragged into this thing. And so like this entire region, this is all connected stuff. And then Turkey's connected, and all of a sudden, yeah, Turkey and Israel really are going to look at, who is running, who's going to be a hegemon or a mini hegemon or whatever. All that is, it's crazy how fast and how tight and interconnected all this is. And by the way, the entire time I'm saying this, Switzerland is always in there, like trying to help balance things out, And so, like now I'm in Europe, like it's all crazy.
But it wasn't fast. That's the thing. None of this was fast. There's certain things come out, they verify sort of what we've been talking about, and the elements of things that we share at times. Because we were tracking fighters moving across from Afghanistan. I mean, those 30-something training camps are producing, fighters, each of them perhaps 1,000 a month, a lot of them, and they go back to their home countries, Africa and wherever else, reskilled and so on and so forth. A large number of them are going into Syria. And about a count we have between, say, 10 to 12,000. And the general attitude of the U.S. under the Biden administration was, we don't see it. We don't see it. And I'm like, well, they're there, and we've got the videos of them. They're there. And then Assad gets taken down in 11 days. And we knew at least the last 6 months of 2024 that Turkey was bringing them in.
Yeah.
And then, Trump comes out and says, well, Turkey brought these guys in. And I was like, yeah, none of this is a surprise. None of this happened instantly. None of this happened overnight. We knew it was coming, but rather than be prepared for it, it was Operation Ostrich.
Right. Let me go back again, because as you add these layers in, I think it's important to continue to like talk about the time, the political ambition, all these other things that go into this. So let's go back to phase one, and let's also bring in a new president coming into power here. 3 days, right? And so all of a sudden, this whole thing changes. So let's talk a bit about phase one, the Trump administration, and how. I mean, what do you expect? Like, we don't even necessarily have a Secretary of State yet lined up, right? Like that stuff's all going to get sorted out here pretty quick. But we have a new guy. No matter what we do, we have a new guy next week. How does that impact phase one and the stability of that region? Is there a grace period where, like, hey, give those guys 15 minutes to get caught up? And by 15 minutes, it might be 6 months. It's not the only job. Yeah.
You've got each phase in each period. Each phase is in like 42 days for each phase.
Right.
To commence certain things, at least you can't finish this stuff in that period of time. But phase one is pretty much dedicated to increasing humanitarian aid, and is dedicated to the release of prisoners and obviously the cessation of hostilities. Phase two is sort of commencing the sustainable calm. And we sort of knew this. I mean, there's differing opinions about whether a single phase peace deal would be better, but there just aren't the guarantors for that. But it would have gotten all the hostages back alive, but it wouldn't likely result in a lasting peace. That's another phrase that we were using. We came up with, very, very carefully in those briefs about what it means and when to use that and how to use that and how to structure that. But so about May, really started looking at the issues facing Gaza post Hamas. How do you deal with this much damage? How do you manage Rafah crossing? And so, in discussions with the Palestinian Authority, it was they said that they would be most pleased to see UBAM Rafah, which is a European border assistance mission, operate that, because UBAM Rafah had a mandate from like over a decade ago that still exists. They weren't particularly great then, but they need to be great now. And that opinion is also held within elements of the United Nations Security Council. So that's a piece there, because no one will, the Palestinians and the Israelis won't want UNRWA. I mean, both parties want, well, the Palestinian Authority and Israel wouldn't want that, and that's a perfectly reasonable position to hold given what's happened. So Yibam Rafah, get that crossing open, because the risk of corruption is so great on that border, and we need to prevent interested parties trying to rearm Hamas via what remains the tunnel system or through smuggling. So I started that very early there, and then the conversation sort of becomes, okay, how do you administrate Gaza? What would a government look like?
Right.
And then we knew around September 10th, because there was a letter from Hamas that I got to read and I got to verify the audio with it, that said they were willing to hand over to a civilian and technocratic government, which is huge. But shortly after
that part again, because it was a little bit broken up. Say that. What are they willing to do?
They were willing to hand over power to a civilian and technocratic government. But then 7 days after that, Nasrallah gets killed, and then I think first few days of October, Yahya Sinwar gets killed. So that puts everything in a very unknown space. Now, to the credit of the Palestinian Authority and Hamas, they continue to hold conversations around November in Cairo around the transfer of power to Greek key points. And so we haven't understood the costs of quiet. So when you see these numbers come out, experts say we need $50 billion. That's just people who haven't really been involved in this, just kind of looking at the situation, doing it, well, I think. It's like, well, no. In terms of a lot of this, a lot of what's needed has been worked out by the people on the ground, who don't get consulted nearly enough. So it's sort of a mixed bag. It's good that it was considered such a non-permissive environment, and nobody really had the courage to have these conversations besides, elements of Hamas in Cairo and the Palestinian Authority. It means this concept got fairly well developed. There are some things that need to be worked out still, but because that happened, we don't need to engage unnecessary think tanks in states, in the East Coast.
Yes.
Yeah. Because they would not be additive. They would be disruptive, because they don't have nearly enough understanding of the cultures and societies and the stakeholders and the personalities and the political nuances,
Sure.
and the relationships. It would just be a disaster. So it's kind of been a good thing. But now that we're here, the hard work and all right, this work has been done. Do not try to reinvent the wheel for some stupid contract issuance or some stupid budget. You have a budget, just put your finger on it, and then have a look, and then allocate the budget to the need. Don't create the budget, then make up your own needs.
You said words a few minutes ago that made me go and put a pin in that, come back to that, because I always got to circle back when you and I have these conversations. I don't know where you are on this. You don't have to say anything about this, but I'll say where I am at, and then you can take that and do what you want with it. When you say the words Atlantic Council, I go, fuck, those guys. I don't care for them. One, they're funded in part by, if we don't like oligarchs, guess what? They got oligarchs. But they're their oligarchs, the ones that they like. They have funding from Arab countries that have purposes that are cross other people's interests, especially if you're we're talking about green initiatives and we're funded by the Arabs. And it's like, oh, come on, man. So there's all this, and I'm not saying anybody individually is bad at the Atlantic Council, but at some point they exist because someone big who wants an outcome funds their work. And a lot of it, from the U.S. point of view, is foreign money and Russian Ukrainian money, where you're like, "Ooh, these aren't the guys we want to have paying for outcomes." And the U.S. is notorious for picking felons and the wrong person for partners. We do this all the time. So when you say Atlantic Council, I'm like, yeah, I don't want those guys involved, because they're not like. Here's what happens in the U.S. People will go to the State Department, and when I show up, when the ground truth guy shows up, when I see the State Department, I'm like, oh, there's a problem here. there's a problem here. And it's not that it's the people, it's not the villagers, it's the State Department person. They get things wrong all the time. When it comes to getting a passport and all that, yeah, they're great at that stuff, but they are reliably wrong. And then after being reliably wrong for their entire careers, they're like, now I'm going to go get a sweet gig over at the Atlantic Council. Now I'm tearing down the Atlantic Council right now. There's a lot of think tanks out there.
There are a lot more troublesome entities. Like the crisis group, who have literal members of the Taliban attached to them.
Right.
And the Atlantic Council, is generally I would consider the better of a model that I'm not always comfortable with, because they can be more academic in terms of they choose certainly the better, dangerous, and had to deal with the impact of these far more dangerous people. What amounts to law. In this instance, I think the most important players are some of the Gulf states. Yes, the UAE hates Mohammed Abbas. Yes, the man they want to replace him with. Mohammed Abbas is also very old. He's in his 90s or whatever. Will he live long enough to be able to manage this? Is he able to manage this? But I don't like other states choosing a representative for a country. That's a decision that needs to be made by the people of that country.
Sure.
As freely and fairly as possible to determine the person who has the best vision for their country and for their country's relationships to other countries. But in this particular instance, because of the close-knit relationships that President Trump has with Saudi Arabia, that has with Qatar, he has with the UAE, and then because the other Gulf states obviously have their opinions on Qatar, that these are in a sense one of the important safeguards to achieving the other phases and to achieving reconstruction, and that the willingness of countries like Jordan and these others, the other Arab states, to come forward and say, we will guarantee the security of Israel. They're declaring, in a sense, that they're not participant in the idea of a race Arab state. And that becomes very, very important. And that becomes very, very important in how this gets managed and the kinds of things that get done. And you have to give the goals. They're very building stuff, very building infrastructure, and probably to position have that.
We have a little bit of a Wi-Fi problem somewhere in our mix. So
could be mine. It's a bit shaky at times.
Either way. So I didn't get all that you just said, but I got the gist of it. So
essentially, the Gulf states have an important role to play.
Right.
I think that we talk about stakeholder engagement, but as I said, that most of this has taken place outside of State Department, outside of think tanks, outside of these bodies. Is a positive thing because they were interested in what these entities have to say. One of the key for a long time about we need a peacekeeping force, and when you talk to Palestinians, they will tell you we have 18,000 security personnel. Right? And so I had this discussion with them. It's like, okay, what is it? What rationalization of police force? With radios, going to need vehicles. We in the not one permanent presence peacekeeping force. Will have is training programs.
Yeah. Will you turn your video off? Let's see if that improves your signal because it's breaking up enough that I think it's distracting for anybody who's listening. And while you do that, I will talk and I will say, hey, everybody, this is Break It Down Show. And if you want to support the show, go to breakitdownshow.com. Usually, this is my standard thing when I'm vamping.
No problem. I've only got the option like cam. It's both of them.
Okay.
Oh, hang on. Here it is. I found it.
You found it. Okay. And so that's a great way to support the show. And all that money goes in my pocket and it puts me on the road. I'm going to be on the road up north next week, so all these things or equipment, whatever it is that I'm doing, you all help fund that. I don't have to run ads. I'd like to not run ads. And it's always great. There are a lot of people already supporting the show. If you join them, that'll be great for me. Thanks for that. And so we'll see how we do now, Scott, with the Wi-Fi. But Donald Trump is the kind of person who's going to lean on business relationships, deals, getting things built, right? That's what he's great at. And look, you don't gotta like the guy. He is great at that. You want to get a hotel built, you want it to be 500 feet high. That's a good guy to talk to, right? So he is going to look at these things as potential solutions. He's for sure going to work on expanding the Abraham Accords, and he's going to do his best by creating business alliances. This is just Pete's belief, to try to stabilize that region and make it more valuable to build as opposed to destroy. How am I doing?
I would say that's exactly it. And I'd say that, when you look at basically Israel is a net cost to the US. And Israel, this war can't become Trump's Ukraine. He inherits it from Biden. And then he's lumbered with this thing, which is why he very expressly said that he wants this war over before he's in office, which is why we're seeing phase one rushed at the end. Literally Sunday, I think, is the 19th. But when he takes his inauguration, he doesn't want this happening. So everything's kind of set against that. And that was taken out of context, by what was called the Hasbara, which is, a propaganda unit. To say, Trump's given us permission to do whatever it takes. It's like, no, what he doesn't want. But yes, he will try to solve this through business. But when you look at the wealth of the Gulf states, all they need to do is retract investment. And we've already seen some talk from large UAE companies about investing $20 billion into America. And it's a drop in the ocean for them.
Yeah.
So there'll be deals. And then for American interests wholesale, the collapse of the region doesn't benefit really anything. It would just enable other powers to come in and gain more influence and push U.S. trade out of the defense sector. Turkey's pushed in heavily in the region. So yeah, there's no benefit in that sense. So I agree he will business lead. He'll lead with money.
How has the election impacted we'll just talk in general, all of the conflicts that you have your finger on the pulse of, but how has his election impacted how the other parties are behaving?
Hugely. In a very, he is disruptive by nature because he's unpredictable, and then unpredictability is also useful. And he isn't. There was a clear vision, not a good vision, under the Obama period and carried through by Biden. It ultimately comes out of Hillary's State Department for the Middle East. The Arab Spring occurs under that. Libya is still a disaster because of that. And so it felt very much like we'd walked back into another 4 years of instability and conflicts everywhere. And Trump isn't part of that mechanism wherever this plan wanted to go. And he doesn't have those kinds of advisors around him. So no one really knows where he would land. I mean, Netanyahu and a lot of his government thought Trump was going to come in and give them just complete unquestioning support for their war, and he'd go to war against Iran and all these other things. And that hasn't happened. Whereas Biden would say verbally, we're concerned about the use of these 2,000-pound bombs, and if you don't increase aid, then we're not going to supply these anymore for use in Gaza. I mean, the Restraint on Munitions Acts were not about restricting Israel's ability to defend against strikes from Iran or from Hezbollah. It was the use of heavy munitions in densely populated civilian areas. So Trump has been. We wouldn't have a ceasefire straight up if Trump hadn't put those hard lines, and when Trump gives you a hard line, it's
He
real.
means it. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. He
and it's
doesn't draw a red line and ignore it later on when you cross it. He doesn't do that.
no, I
Yeah.
actually kind of interesting.
Even to his detriment. He's like, no,
Yeah.
I told you it's going to happen. Yeah.
I find interesting, even recently that Trump's pick was he ceasefire in Lebanon. Frozen again.
Oh, yeah. No, okay, you're good. Yeah, the say about the ceasefire in Lebanon again.
There was a statement, I think, yesterday or the day before, Trump expects fire in Lebanon to halt.
Yeah.
My camera first.
Yeah, we'll see how that does.
Yeah, we'll see how that
maybe
goes.
it doesn't. Yeah, I also have my cat walking around too, so maybe the cat's helping entertain people.
Yeah. So what was clear was that he just sent a message: we want the ceasefire to hold Lebanon, because it was
Right.
Israel had broken the ceasefire. And what's very different about Trump's politics is that he tells you once. It's not underhanded. It's not some phone call to somebody where a deal is made behind the. It's like, this is what we want. This is what we expect.
Yeah.
And it's actually kind of good, because it's like, okay, we know what we're dealing with.
Yeah.
And it doesn't need to be duplicitous or surreptitious. It's like straight out. We are America. This is what America wants. And I think that's the phrase they use. America doesn't want the ceasefire broken. It's like, wow.
Right. Yeah.
I think that's healthy in a way, in many ways.
Yeah. I don't want this to be a commercial for President Trump, because he's got his problems, and then it's not going to be a smooth sailing ship. But I've talked to a lot of people who work inside and have a lot of experience working in the Beltway, DC area, and they're hugely disappointed that we've continued to go in the direction we've gone. The dismissal of the Biden administration from outside expert help, and their unwillingness to include other things. And again, pursuing this foreign policy that, from my point of view, as a person who worked within it, has been hugely a failure the last quarter century, and has caused a lot of problems with no end to problems in sight. And I would even say those people that you were talking to that talked to Biden, or whoever it is now, those folks were desperate for a fight with Russia. I mean, a lot of them have written their PhD papers on, here's how we're going to fight and beat Russia. Why? Their economy is insignificant. Look, I'm not. If Putin is a problem, okay, that's a different conversation. But we were so desperate for this fight to happen, we made it happen, and now we have all this cost and billions of dollars, and forget about the inhumanity of all that war. It's terrible. Like, we're trying to save the environment. A war is terrible for the environment, but here we are.
I mean, the reality of the Biden administration was we were not allowed to say Afghanistan. We were not allowed to say Al Qaeda or any intelligence on these groups and their growth, their interaction, their strategies, their activities, their participation, their wealth generation, their distribution of monies, their vision, their objectives. You simply weren't allowed to talk about. And now, as we come into the Biden administration, we're suddenly getting this heightened threat level from terror. It's like, yeah, we've been telling you this is much like the fighters going to Syria. We've been monitoring various things for a very long time.
Yeah.
And so the only time that it was, I like to be apolitical. I'm not an American. I have no interest in. When I say no interest, I care for my American friends, but American domestic policy is not my place, not my lane. But when you're working with host nation that's impacted by American foreign policy, that area and that field changes. And the difference when I would get tasked on things, we got more done, well, I wouldn't call it a lot, under the Biden. I got more done under the Biden administration in the last year with Israel, Gaza, to positive effect, not ceasefire, not hostage release, but on other issues, not really even humanitarian, but just on those few things that I had to deal with. Basically, when a crisis hit international community in Gaza, then you get stuff done. But with Trump, it's different, and I say I have no endorsement one way or another. It's not my job. and it's not my place, but in terms of being able to work with his administration, and have a better evaluation of data, I'd say it's much, much better on the evaluation of information. Because as I go back to saying, it's not my job to influence or direct things. It is merely to present information and the evidence for it, and the decision is the decision of whomever. But the responsiveness to information is certainly better.
Yeah. Phase one, late phase one, phase two. How worried are you about those things breaking down?
When you're doing a hostage negotiation or you're doing any crisis situation, you take it one day at a time. And I'm a family representative for one of the hostage families that will not come out until phase two. And it's a matter of you just do your best every single day, and you move that needle every single day. And then to look at the challenges that come up each day. This animal changes each day. As I sort of said before, earlier in the year, you'd think on a Saturday, you'd be like, okay, looks like we're close to a ceasefire. So it's like we might see something positive happen and then torpedoed. But understanding the actors and the stakeholders involved, we're a lot smarter on what we're dealing with. But now it's just hard, diligent, thorough, thoughtful, considered work to look at the needs and to look at the personalities and say, okay, and then to talk to the parties, and then come out with the report. So by the way, go to many countries. So this again is not secretive information. This is not, so there's an even playing field that everybody understands as what you and I would call the ground truth. Unilaterally, everybody understands equally. Nobody has privilege. But it's delicate, but it's one day at a time. So I can't say. We've just got to do the hard work.
Yeah. Well, and I often say, when we do this kind of work, and again, I'm equating our jobs because we do have that ground truth sensibility. It's it's deliberate, it's delicate, it's fraught with errors, and if you're not making mistakes, you're making the first mistake. Like this stuff is it's not gentle work. It's hugely frustrating, and it's got an elasticity where it takes an enormous amount of energy to pull that band to get it to the anchor points to have it hold. And that band is still going to try to break those anchor points or tear itself apart, right? Stability is very tough to achieve.
I mean, what you find though, I mean, I can't go into sort of detail, but I've been talking to one very sort of, just a country that I've risk concerns over. When you speak to the different factions, whether they be, ethnic or tribal, ultimately they have the precise same concerns. And that's becoming really interesting. Like there is a space in here where if you have the right approach, you can actually solve everybody's concerns, because everybody wants to see their economy develop. Even people that, it's not Afghanistan, but even though to use the example of Afghanistan, you could probably say of all the ethnic communities and groups and things and tribes in Afghanistan, they would all love to see the country be economically successful. They would like to see peace. Just that the problem is that the people that that are running them now have a very singular division on how they believe society should behave. But if you asked each party what they wanted, it would be the same thing. There's been a really, really interesting thing to look at diametrically opposed groups, and they're not really diametrically opposed.
Yeah,
they just need to become tolerant of each other's different religious, beliefs.
Yeah,
and
I mean,
that's it.
If you took two diametrically opposed tribes, let's say, like these guys have murderous revolution between them, they want to fight, they cause intra and inter-tribal fighting, and if the main sheikh says to the other sheikh, "Hey, you sell cars, don't you? Yeah, I'll buy 1,000 if you chill out." That guy's gonna chill out. He's gonna chill out. Hell yeah, I'll sell 1,000 cars today. And so, I mean, I'm simplifying something very complex, but then both sheikhs will be like, "Hey, chill out. That dude's all right. He bought 1,000 cars from me. Now I can help you take care of your baby, do what, blah, 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 make a long list of things," right? And so sometimes just as simple as just buying 1,000 cars.
Yeah. I mean, one of the big pain points for this kind of stuff is education. Because, you know, there's the idea that there's a kind of a standardization of Western education, which is considered true or untrue the education that we've mastered. And obviously we haven't. But it doesn't consider the cultural context of societies. Now, I mean, I would quite simply say you need STEM. And then if you want to have religious schools after your day hours, go have them.
Yeah.
You know, but have your culture and stuff like that, and your social stuff contextual to the society you're in.
There's
Because
a lot in what you just said.
Yeah,
It's,
Boko Haram translates as Western education is forbidden because it's seen as our values, whereas your sciences are hard sciences. But be respectful of the culture for the social stuff. And then if people want to be secular, if you want to send your kid to a madrasa from 3:30 to 5:30, go for it. Knock yourself out.
Yeah. This is a big point. And when I'm saying this so everybody understands. I'm not talking at Scott like I'm saying this to him. We're going to have a conversation about this, but in the U.S. in particular, especially in our educated scholar class, they don't understand that nobody else really has a separation of church and state. Not like we try to do it, where we get mad if you even talk about religion. But the fact is Boko Haram or all these other sub elements. Religion is a main part of how they govern their lives. It's a main part of the culture. And if you ignore that and act like it doesn't exist, then you're missing a giant portion of the fight that's going on. And you cannot reliably navigate from here to a solution if you act like and we want to make it secular or non-secular, right? But like the Iraqis told me over and over again, we're not religious. It was more like blacks and whites from America not getting along politically, right? And so those are the Catholics, and we don't like them. Not because of how they worship, but because we don't like them as a group. Not because about God or Jesus or whatever. They're different than us. It's a power battle, not a religious battle in so many occasions. But we cannot lose sight of the fact that it says Allah Akbar on the Iraqi flag. And for a while, the government of Afghanistan had the word Islamic in it. So the religion thing, God, man, our educated, like high-end, again, State Department people, they do not like the separation of church and state. They do not like that, or they do not like religion to be part of the state or the state. They do not like it when you bring up like it's okay to understand mosques and people and how they make decisions, because at the ground level, religion is important to these folks in the way that they consider it important.
I mean, we are delusional if we think Christianity doesn't play a role in Western society. It's only because, I mean, functionally, the legal system that we have, at least the criminal system, derives ultimately from the biblical elements in it, and then to a degree, your civil code will also as well. But it's so embedded in it that we don't see it. We have this idea that it's not present. No, it underwrote everything that we have in terms of how society. Just because we're not raised with church and with religion in school so much, because it's already there. And these are Islamic societies where the dominant population is Islamic. But it's I think that the United Arab Emirates has done a spectacular job on having everyone from every nationality there, and it is an Islamic society where you have to follow relatively relaxed Islamic rules compared to some other interpretations. But if you want to cover yourself, if a woman wants to cover herself, in a burqa and a niqab, whatever else they can, and nobody would want to wear gloves and all that, and the other accoutrements of conservative Islam. Yes. She's chosen to live that way. It's her right to live that way. It's the religion. Respect it.
Yeah.
Nobody's threatened. If somebody is, if you want to go to church as a Christian, there are churches there. There's a synagogue in Abu Dhabi now. So you can pray how you want and nobody gets offended. Nobody's threatened. And I think that model foreign Islamic society is very, very healthy, and that you can worship and live and all that is asked, and there is no tolerance of religious intolerance. That is a severe crime.
Yeah.
And they've done it well to balance these, and it's impressive. And I think that has a lot of instruction. I think it has a lot of instruction when we want to look at taking advice on how to help Islamic countries. You talk to people on the ground, and you talk to them, and you find, the Taliban go to the UAE all the time. You'll find these people from all these different groups, and they're very respectful when they go. They don't run around saying that this is a deviation of Islam and it's not true Islam. They don't dare do any of that.
Yeah.
Right. It's like the Twitterati, saying Saudi Arabia is, abusing religion and this and that, and it's Islam. It's like, you wouldn't say it if you were there.
Yeah.
So there's a lot to learn from each other, I guess, and I think we need to be very thoughtful of our interventions.
And allow religion to be a thing. We work with this Jordanian colonel and in Afghanistan, and he said, I'm going to show you guys how to use Islam in a positive way, right? Like, this is where this works. Is like when the Taliban gets mad at you for burning a Quran, every time they burn a school, guess what's in it? You guys are getting played by religion because we ignore it. And then when we do look at it, and this is just direct experience, we'll have chaplains who are not necessarily PhD educated. These guys are people that came up in a church, and God bless the guy, go run your flock. But these guys look at weapon, like I've heard them say the words religion as a weapon system. And okay, maybe that's a possible thing, but you don't have the credentials to do that, and looking at different imams or other cleric type leaders and deciding what their message is to their people and making value judgments about it is very, very problematic. To get that right in a foreign country, oh my God!
It's the unseen baggage and unseen bias that the West can bring to these things by not living among or knowing. And Cigar put out something a couple of days ago, so talking about the length of tours of duties that it takes. I mean, five months is nothing in an Islamic culture for bond building, but they say by the 6th month, the tour is over, and they've just started to get to know people, started to build trust, and then a new face comes in. Can't operate like that.
No, for sure.
Can't build relations like that, and we just keep repeating these failures. But Gaza is an opportunity to get something right and to be more thoughtful, and it's critical importance of calling that war off, to call the whole region off, because it could become much more catastrophic much more quickly, and to keep malign actors out of situations that prohibit the proper development of Gaza post Hamas, so that Palestinians can have dignity in their lives and not have a motivation to threaten Israel, with their pointless rockets that do essentially no damage, but just provocate violence against Gazan civilians. And Hamas needs to reflect that they tried to sacrifice the lives of Gazans to induce a greater war against Israel in their pursuit of Israel's destruction, and it failed. And all it cost, whatever that people try to come out and say, oh, it's a victory for Hamas. No, it's not. The country is devastated. And, we talk about, probably 60-something thousand civilian deaths at this point, because it was a very weird, at one point it was like mid last year, it was like, 40,000 dead, and the bombing hasn't stopped, but the numbers didn't go up for the civcats. But that doesn't include the wounded, the limbless. The people that are dying because they can't get medicine, like literal can't get cancer meds. And all this stuff that kind of happens around it that I get to see. We'll have to deal with, like, the politics of getting aid into the country, the reality of what gets in the country. Hasn't been aid, it's been merchant goods, and then that drives the price of food into insane levels that nobody can afford. But, Hamas won nothing Gaza would have, Jabalia, 70% of homes have been destroyed. There would be, all those families would have a house. They wouldn't be coming back to devastation. Had Hamas not launched October 7th.
Yeah.
There's no victory in this.
It's awful. It's a terrible failure. And unfortunately, we continue to not learn this lesson. So we continue to have to dig back out of these things. And,
well, I'm hoping. I don't know if hoping is the word. As I said, we have a lot of work to do to protect the integrity of the phases. We have a lot of work to do to ensure that the right conversations are held with the right people and receive the right support and have the same and have the necessary accountability and monitoring, but also that we send the right technical expertise to assist on these matters. And we don't have a civilian contractor frenzy where DynCorp just grabs people with improper experience and puts them in a role.
Yeah. Right.
We can't do that.
Yeah. And have the government on our end be like, hey, as long as those seats are filled, we don't care. We'll pay you. Because that's really what happens in the contracting. I'm being very cruel to the contracting industry, but like I can go get a job doing Intel stuff and I could do nothing. Like every day put zero. And I've had this job. You put zero on the board, but zero, like, doesn't matter. As long as you're there in that chair, it's all that matters, right? And so we have this hugely expensive way. And I don't want to put a zero on the board. I want to help. So what your point is well taken, and it is so very true. Listen, I've got a packed day, but today's my birthday.
No, it's been amazing. Sorry, my Wi-Fi was a little unstable. It's just the nature of where we are at the moment.
We'll get there. We'll get there. Yeah, it's always a pleasure to talk to you, though, man, and I appreciate it.
No, it's brilliant.
It makes part of my birthday celebration is getting a chance to talk to you and talk about ground truth. Oh shit, I love it. I love it. And so I'm gonna have you back on again soon. Yeah, today. Yeah,
Happy birthday.
Well, thank you. I've got a show in another hour. It's good, man. I'm having a great day.
Brilliant. Well, there was a lot to download in this. We got a good coverage of most of the key issues because I could talk for hours like this because it's just all sitting in my head. And it's all been worked on quietly and patiently.
Yeah, the best way, doing the work, right? Deliberate and getting it done. So everybody, if you're watching, I'm doing a new end of the show thing. So thank you all for watching. If you can't subscribe, or if you want to listen or talk to me on X, subscribe there and link in there. So wherever it is, I'm glad to chat with you. And we're in a lot of spots. This is Pete. This is the Break It Down show. This has been Scott. He is a wonderfully gifted person. Follow him, Scott Richards, on X, and you'll get a chance to see what he's talking about day to day. It's fascinating stuff. So everybody, thank you very much for watching, and I will see you all in about an hour. And Scott, I'll chat with you in a minute. Bye-bye, everybody.
Perfect. Thank you very much.